Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Thank you for joining us on tonight's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombandra. Now, terrorism has long been a matter of concern on the African continent. The attack on Nairobi's Westgate Mall earlier this year came as a complete surprise to everyone, including Kenya's security services. However, this violence does not seem to have produced the awareness required to prevent such an attack from repeating. Nigeria soon followed. Hundreds of schoolgirls were kidnapped by Boko Haram, the violent rebel group that has terrorized northern Nigeria. Critics argue that Nigeria's security services have also proven incapable of preventing further bombings and shootings. So the situation has escalated further with more loss of life. Why is it so hard to prevent such violence from reoccurring? Joining me in studio to discuss terrorism in Africa is Paul O'Sullivan. He's a certified fraud examiner at Paul O'Sullivan and Associates. And also joining us from our Nairobi studios is Suresh Kumar. He's a principal officer at APA Insurance. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for making the time to join us. Paul, let's maybe start off by looking at whether Africa has a crisis. We have from time to time looked at these incidents of terror on the continent in silos, but we're seeing increasing repetition at a closer phase. Would we now say that we have a crisis on our hands?
I think that's probably a bit of a, an over-exaggeration. We certainly have a problem, but I don't think it's a crisis yet. I mean, there would be a crisis in certain parts of Africa. For example, the Horn of Africa, that's been in crisis for a long time. I don't think it'd be fair to say that Kenya has a crisis yet. I think they've had a wake-up call and they have to apply their minds to deal with it. Certainly parts of Nigeria appear to have become ungovernable, and I think that's a big question for the Nigerian government to resolve those issues. And we're seeing an emergence now of transnational terrorism, terrorists that operate from one country into another and then move back again. And I think that's something that needs to be dealt with as well. And if it's not dealt with fairly quickly, it will see a drop in investor confidence. Suresh,
let's get your take on that question, in particular whether from where you sit you would say that the continent is plunged in crisis, or would that be a bit sensationalist as has been suggested in Johannesburg?
I think I agree with Paul to say that it might be a little overstretched to say that it's a crisis at this stage. According to one of the recent surveys done by Aon, the political violence risk map which they had done for 2014, 47 countries out of 43 countries out of 54 countries in Africa have had political violence and terrorism ranging from severe to medium risks. It's only 11 countries that have very low risks. But if you take the countries which have been rated as severe, it's only about 5 countries which have a severe rating from this. So coming back to Kenya, where I am presently, I think, yes, I agree, unless it is really handled immediately by the security forces, it could turn up into a crisis at this stage.
Maybe, Paul, let's get and latch on to that point that Suresh makes now, and that is the response that we've seen from governments responding to terror. Has the response inspired confidence in the investor community that we have a handle on this problem?
I think they've sent out the right signals, but they need to send out more of those signals. They are working in partnership with other countries. Kenya aren't standing on their own in this matter, and I think the support they're getting is starting to come to the fore. What you have to understand is that if you haven't got a machine in place that's tried and tested and been in operation for a long time to deal with terrorism, to acquire those skills overnight can be a little bit of a challenge. So I think what's happened is other countries have come to the fore. They're assisting Kenya, and Kenya recognises that they've got a problem and they are busy crafting the solution. I think investor confidence has probably been a little bit shaken, but it's not broken. At the end of the day, it's not like tourism. Tourism quickly reacts. You know, we saw, for example, many years ago in Egypt, there were some terrorist incidents there. The hotels were standing empty for months afterwards. Visits were cancelled. I believe Kenya's had some similar challenges.
Paul, let me also maybe get your insights into the Nigerian response, because I think there might be comparable differences in terms of what we've seen as an official response on the Kenyan side versus what we've seen on the Nigerian side. Can we speak in the same terms of the response by the Nigerian government?
At this stage, regrettably not. I think the response from the Kenyan government has been far more decisive. The response from the Nigerian government has been somewhat indecisive, and I think that's left the gap open for the terrorists to keep coming back for more, and that's what they've been doing. Remember, the reason why terrorists do what they do is, you know, they have this ideological situation. They want to get publicity. And unfortunately, the Boko Haram terrorists in Nigeria have got far more publicity from their conduct than perhaps has happened in the case of the attacks in Kenya. And I think it's been handled better in Kenya. The media have handled it better, and the global media have handled it better. I think what's, you know, what the world are looking for out of Nigeria is to see a plan of action. Yeah. Let's have your plan, put it on the table, and let's see you act on it.
Based on an earlier point, Suresh, that Paul has raised, and this is the vulnerability of the tourism sector and how we see that reacting very quickly to terror attacks, are we able to quantify the economic impact that the terror attacks in Kenya have had on the tourism sector?
Yes, in fact, I was in Mombasa very recently, and I was told that about 24,000 people, both casual and temporary workers in the hotel industry, have been laid off. Most of the hotels in Mombasa and other areas are virtually empty or giving out such attractive discounts, but in spite of that, the number of tourists which are coming in are far and few. Just to take the point saying that, you know, unfortunately the media, I don't think the media has been fair for Kenya or any other countries to say that things are much more peaceful than what it seems to be. There's so much of exaggeration about a particular incident happening in some one part of the country. Recently we had a situation wherein some of the governments of certain countries have not only issued travel advisories against traveling into Kenya, but even the existing tourists were sort of sent off immediately.
Yes.
Now such kind of an action sends out a negative kind of a response outside.
Suresh, staying on that point, we learned that the the American government has also issued a travel advisory in Nigeria, in particular saying that those in Nigeria should be careful over the coming weekend. What would be the appropriate response from the home government, i.e. Kenya or Nigeria?
In terms of these security alerts which keep on coming, even in Kenya also we constantly get these alerts to say that, no, keep off from this place, keep off that particular mall is a particular target. But these things are bound to happen. The terrorists have the advantage of striking whenever they want it. Unless we are able to improve the state intelligence agencies much more so that you are able to prevent an attack, or when an attack takes place, at least to minimize the damage as much as possible. Otherwise what happens is that in terms of the people who are living in the country as well as the foreign investors who are coming in, there would definitely be a shake in the confidence.
Let's talk about prevention, and this is perhaps a point that Suresh has raised, which is really important. Are we seeing the right type of investments and the right type of policies coming from targeted governments to show that we're being proactive about preventing terrorism?
Well, you have to remember, prevention of terrorism has to be, you can't take a shotgun approach. You have to take what we call a sniper approach. You have to be very precise about what you're doing.
Interesting choice of words.
Well, I just use it as a sort of analogy, because if you take a shotgun approach to dealing with terrorism, and your fight back affects the wrong people, you actually create a breeding ground for terrorism. And we've seen that in a number of countries already in the last few years, where the response of government is inappropriate. Sending fighter jets in to populated areas is not the proper response to terrorism. What you have to do, your response must be intelligence driven. If it's not intelligence driven, you're going to be going after the wrong targets. You'll get what we call collateral damage. And I think looking at what the Kenyan government have been doing recently, their response has been appropriate and it has been intelligence driven. So I think they're moving in the right direction, and that sends out the right signals, by the way.
Suresh, being in the insurance industry, I'm no doubt you have, or the industry has come under fire in terms of perhaps benefiting from a lot of this negativity that we see that surrounds terrorism. Is that a reflection? Is that reflection true? Is the insurance industry benefiting from terrorism in Africa?
Well, I wouldn't know whether you can call it benefiting, but then yes, there is a market which is existing. What had happened was when we had the political violence in 2007, a lot of organizations, businesses, and did not have the political violence extension in their policies, consequently which none of the companies could really compensate them. Now following that, the awareness regarding political violence was much higher, and in the last year's elections, everybody took the extension for political violence and terrorism in their policies. But very ironically, immediately after we had a very, very peaceful elections and the new government settled in, many people went ahead and cancelled their policies. Only to realize when the Westgate happened, many companies, many organizations, many motor vehicle owners did not have this extension, consequently which we could not compensate them. Now that has created a tremendous awareness in terms of people have to take this extension, which has resulted in two things. Number one, yes, the premiums have increased for the insurance company, but also because of this number of incidents growing, the cost of insurance has also gone up. In some cases, I mean, it's estimated about 20 to 30% cost has gone up because we thought Westgate would be the last kind of an incident, but then we had sporadic incidents keep on happening in different parts of the country. And the London market, which is primarily the biggest market for us in terms of reinsuring the major risks of Kenya and East Africa, the kind of perception which the underwriters have in London about Kenya or East Africa is quite different. Which means that the premiums the cost of doing business or the cost of insuring your own premises or the businesses has gone up.
And Paul, let's get your take on this before we go to break. The cost of insurance has gone up, which obviously means the cost of doing business in some of these rather attractive markets has gone up. How significant is this? Is it a big enough of a deterrent for investors to take a step back?
No, it's not. Investors, when they set out to invest in a country, they're looking at what their returns are going to be. Now, investing in Africa, in a lot of the countries in Africa, is not low risk. There's a certain amount of risk attached. And they know this when they come into the market. I mean, in some countries, governments can change overnight at the drop of a hat. So they know this when they come into the market. And they take a more bullish approach to the way they're going to do business. But if eventually, you know, the cost of doing business in a country, they look at it and they say, well, hang on a second, it's becoming too expensive now. Let's look at what we're doing here. But I think, generally speaking, Africa has still got a lot of resources to be exploited. Unfortunately, the tourism industry, as I say, is the first to get knocked. And the World Tourism Organization made it clear that in Africa, for every 8 tourists that visit a country, there's 1 job being sustained by those tourists. So if you get 100,000 tourists stop visiting a country in a year, that's going to cause a loss of, you know, 15,000 jobs. So I think when you have a loss of jobs, that has a downturn on the economy, and things change a bit. So I think it's very important, certainly for investors, to make sure that they've analysed the risk properly, and then to make sure they have appropriate insurances in place. Some governments will actually cover the gaps, by the way. Certainly, you'll probably see insurance companies suing certain governments if they think that they haven't protected from terrorism properly, and I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
When we come back from the break, we delve into the terrorism situation in Africa and whether this is a significant deterrent for investors or not. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback. So please send us an email. That's to investafrica@abn360.com or talk to us on Twitter at CNBC Africa using the show's hashtag InvestAfrica. Following me at Nozi Pombandra. Still with me, my guest, Paul O'Sullivan, Certified Forward Examiner at Paul O'Sullivan and Associates. And joining us from my Nairobi studio is Suresh Kumar. He's a Principal Officer at APA Insurance. Suresh, let's come back to you to kick off this regional responses to terrorism. Have we seen significant collaboration between affected countries in a particular region, in particular in East Africa in this context, rallying around a common desire to end terrorism in the region?
Yes, but unfortunately, if you look at it in terms of East Africa, Kenya is the most affected. I mean, other countries like Rwanda, Tanzania or Uganda are not as much as affected. Uganda, yes, they had a little bit of problem some time back. But there has been a coordinated effort between the governments to see that, the curbing of the militancy. We had one of the biggest problems in the past we used to have was the piracy on the seas. And because of the piracy, there was a very, very strong kind of connection between the piracy money, which has been the ransoms which have been collected, which is being channeled to the militants or to the terrorists. Now with all the governments, including the Kenyan government and the various other governments, took a lot of effort in terms of curbing the piracy on the Somalia coast. So obviously that is one big victory, I would say, in terms of ensuring that the piracy money is at least stopped. So there has been a good coordination between few of the governments to see that this is controlled.
Paul, in addition to some regional responses, we've seen even at the level of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon making statements saying that, the United Nations would do everything to support Kenya to take on terrorism. Over and above the talk shops that often occur around such issues, are we seeing any practical initiatives that are?
But I think we have seen. I can't remember how long ago it was, but it wasn't that long ago that fighter jets from a US carrier went into Somalia and they hit some bases there. And that was clearly a very precise target, intelligence driven. And I think that's the type of support that African countries need, and they're clearly getting it. I think we have heard about some troops on the ground or military assistants, shall we call them advisors on the ground in Nigeria now. So I think we are starting to see some support. Remember, if things get out of hand in Africa, it does affect the economy of the world. So these countries have a vested interest, and I think United Nations generally have an interest in making sure that Africa remains as peaceful as possible.
Where does this leave us in our quest for regional integration on the continent? We're pushing for more porous borders, but also the trade-off is that you're allowing for easier movement of terrorists.
Yeah, unfortunately, terrorists, one of the biggest problems we have in Africa is human trafficking. And terrorists have known about those routes for years, so they've been moving along those routes. The very same White Widow, who's now either in Ethiopia or Somalia, left South Africa on a fake South African passport and flew to Kenya. And what they did, they exploited the human trafficking routes. So perhaps what we need to do, and it's a sort of a kickback from anti-terrorism efforts, is start dealing with some of the low-level crimes like human trafficking, and we'll start eating into some of the things that the terrorists are doing. Drug trafficking in Africa is funding terrorists. As Suresh mentioned, the pirates of Somalia, they were funding the terrorists. There's no doubt about it. So if we can cut off their money supply and then get some good intelligence actions going, I think we'll see a reduction in the terrorists, and they've got to be given no place to hide.
Suresh, the White Widow, Paul has put that topic back on the table, and let's look at the response by the South African government, and in particular the then Minister of Home Affairs, Naledi Pandor, distancing South Africa from the White Widow. When you look at responses from implicated countries like that, does it give you the sense that perhaps we're not all on the same page because we're still wanting to preserve the brand image of our respective countries not to be associated with terrorism?
I think so. Sometimes, we forget the realities, and then, we want to either create the brand image or just don't want to accept certain realities. I'm not sure whether White Widow came from South Africa or some other place, but then the fact is that we need to understand that a country has got a crisis, And if a particular terrorist group or a particular person has been associated with that, every effort should be made by every country to say that, okay, how do we really help them? But unfortunately, the reality sometimes, will be different.
Suresh, staying with you, and let's look at some of how other countries around the world have responded to terrorism, in particular looking at initiatives that might have emanated out of the US, out of the UK, following their own incidents. Do you believe that after our terrorist attacks in Africa that we're coming across with the right initiatives to respond, for example, investing heavily in technologies that would allow us to have a better handle over the situation?
Yes, it is. In fact, if you look at the Westgate attack, which is possibly one of the biggest attacks in Kenya we had, and the kind of learnings which the security agencies have had on this one, I'm sure next time something like this happens, they would be much better prepared. This was something which was totally unexpected, and how many other drills you may have or how many mock runs you may have on this one, reality is different. So with this kind of one exposure which they have had, I'm sure the security agencies are much more prepared. And in terms of the investment in terms of security, the government is also investing quite heavily into it. And apart from taking help from other countries, just to take on the question which Paul had mentioned in terms of when we had the terrorist attack over here, we had the security agencies from the US, from the UK, Israel. A lot of people had come to say that how they can assist. So it's all a learning experience for the Kenyan security agencies also, which now they will be much better prepared to handle in case of a crisis next time.
How do we reassure investors that we have the situation under control? What are some of the messages that you think should be emanating from these governments at this time?
Well, I think, it's important that the governments have shown not to be engaged in knee-jerk reaction. The reaction to terrorist incidents has to be appropriate. It has to be measured. It has to be precise. As I say, you've got to target the terrorists themselves. And then you've got to target the crimes that create opportunities for terrorists. For example, corruption. Corruption is one of the biggest terrorist enablers in the world. In 2004, 2 planes were blown up by the so-called Black Widows then, after they took off within half an hour of each other from Domodedovo airport in Moscow. And it transpired that both of those ladies who were suicide bombers that went on the planes were able to get onto the planes by bribing a security officer at the airport to be let through security. And I mean, if they hadn't have been able to pay that bribe and get through, those planes wouldn't have been blown up. The White Widow that we talked about, the South African government, I don't think they distanced themselves from it. I think what they did was they made a comment that they didn't knowingly engage with the terrorists. Now, when you've got terrorists who can go into a country and pay a bribe, which is what happened, and obtain a passport that gives the impression that you're a person who you're not, and you're a South African citizen when you're not, and you can then arrive in another country on that passport, then that's corruption again. And then drug trafficking, these are the areas. So I think there needs to be a bigger effort on those crimes as well. But I'm comfortable that most of the countries, their response is appropriate. I'd like to see Nigeria stepping up to the table a bit more. They really have to demonstrate that they've got a grip on it, and at the moment they're not quite doing that.
Paul, let's get your insights into some of the long-term policy decisions, Suresh, some of the long-term policy decisions that we should be seeing coming out of Kenya to give, again, that reinforce that message that they're on top of the situation and that they're actually dealing with the root causes as against just the symptoms of terrorism.
It has to be a multiple effort. Number one is that, of course, improving the security across and the security intelligence and other areas. Second thing is tackling the social problems, corruption, the porous borders we have. All those things also have to be tackled. At the same time, there has to be, in terms of a message to the investors to say that things are not as bad as what they seem to be. Now, if you look at Nairobi today, if you just go out into the streets, I mean, it's life as usual. There's nothing, I mean, Westgate we had a problem in Westgate last year, but within few weeks, people were back in the malls. Everything is as usual. Now, this is the kind of a message which should be brought out to everybody to say that, no, things are not as bad as what they are made out to be by some of the media. Once, if you're able to do these things on a parallel basis, all these multifaceted approaches, I'm sure the investor confidence will come back, because Africa possibly is one of the next bigger destinations, and we need to really emphasize that things are safe over here.
I think a lot of it's also about people's perception, and I think the perception in the rest of the world is wrong. Certainly in respect of Africa, it's seen as being this third world lawless environment where people can pretty much do what they want, and it's not that way. The recovery time is seen there. For example, in the Madrid bombings, the trains were blown up and people were killed. A week later, everything was back to normal. The number of people that died in 9/11, it was 3,000 people died in 9/11. Tourism visits to America did not come down. 3 people can get killed in a terrorist incident, or 1 person kidnapped and taken away in a terrorist incident, and you get thousands of cancellations. So I think the perception has to be changed, and the media have a role to play there. So the media hopefully will start showing that Africa is not that bad. I've been here for over a quarter of a century, and I wouldn't move home at all. I'm very happy with Africa, and that's all of Africa. I travel around the continent quite a lot, and I think investors, for the most part, if they take appropriate steps for risk management, everything will be fine.
Certainly sounds like the challenge has been thrown back at the media to help and create a positive perception of Africa to the investment community. We've come to the end of this week's episode of Invest Africa. Thank you to my guests. Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.